Woo-hoo-hoo. Hi there, gang. Steve the Amateur Historian. And I'm on a caper. I'm on a mission in the darkness of night. I just got off work, and I got home, and I want to be productive tonight, and I was just starting to feel that, like, work day's done, you sit down, and just suddenly, boom, you feel like you want to fall asleep. And I'm just like, nope, I don't want that to happen. So, I ended up picking up my phone, picking up my feet, and now I am out and about for an evening walk. Thank you for joining me on another episode of EXPLORIAN. Tonight, as it is nighttime, I am continuing my JFK series, focused in on the evidence, the case against Lee Harvey Oswald, as has been my focus in this succession of pieces. And right as one is about to pass me, of course, since I'm out for a walk, there will be the occasional car going by. Hopefully there won't be too much noise. And if there is, my voice will dominate it. Nice Mustang. Anyway, I mean, it is nighttime, so hopefully not as much traffic. But this one's going to be a doozy. It is a given that there's going to be so many things I forget to mention because there's so much to this aspect of the case. And that is the question of whether Lee Harvey Oswald owned the weapon that officially was used to murder President John F. Kennedy. This is a multifaceted aspect of the case. I mean, you're delving into the case of the murder weapon of the president. This is a pretty serious piece of evidence. And it is my stance on the matter, based on all that I've seen, all that I've learned on this matter, that Oswald never owned this rifle. If you listened to a couple episodes back, I discussed the backyard photos and how it's abundantly clear that they were created some other time, some other means, some other person was in these photographs, and then they put Oswald's face on the person to make it look like it was Oswald. And this individual's reportedly holding the rifle that was used to shoot the president. Now, there have been examinations done that show that, compared to Oswald's height, the rifle in the picture's too short. The gun that was removed from the Texas School Book Depository, I just found this little piece of information out recently. The rifle had a strap, so you could kind of hang it on your arm. The rifle in the backyard photos, let me reverse that. The rifle seen that reportedly was taken out of the book depository, there's pictures of an officer holding it and carrying it. The place where you would put a strap on, a strap that you put on, I don't remember what it's called. I don't really know gun lingo. But for the sake of not getting tongue twisted, where that mount is completely different between the gun in the backyard photos and the gun that was found. So, the gun in the picture is not even the same rifle. So, even if you could validate the backyard photos, you can't use them as validation that Oswald owned his rifle. And yet, the most popularly known of the backyard photos was printed on the cover of Life magazine. And this is, by the way, this is posted before the Warren Commission even concluded their case that was the official determination that Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin. They posted this picture on their cover, and the little tagline they had with it was, Lee Harvey Oswald with the weapons he used to kill President Kennedy and Officer Tippit. Well, again, even if you can say the pictures are real, that's a lie because it's a different weapon. That's just one little side note. But officially, I mean, here's the official story in terms of Oswald's history with this rifle that was supposedly found in the Texas School Book Depository on the 6th floor near where officially Oswald shot President Kennedy from. So, several months before the assassination, I want to say February or March, for some reason I can't remember exactly, but pretty much end of winter, start of spring 1963, Oswald apparently sees an ad in a magazine called American Rifleman, advertising a Mannlicher Carcano rifle, and he decides to buy it. Sends a money order copy of the listing to the place where the rifle is being sold from, which is it was like Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago, Illinois. They, reportedly have a paper trail to show that Oswald used a fake name, A. Hidell, and then after he was arrested, he was ultimately found with a piece of identification on him that said Alec J. Hidell. So they made the connection there. And I say it was ultimately found on him because, one crazy reoccurrence in this wild assassination story is people, these searches were done and they wouldn't turn a certain something up. And then several searches later, suddenly something turns up. Well, that was the case for this piece of identification that was reportedly found on Oswald that had reportedly his picture on it, even though it's clearly a picture of the second Oswald, because it's not him. In the picture, it's just his look-alike, and it says Alec J. Hidell on it. And when he was first searched by police, this wasn't found on him. It was found on him a couple hours later, after he'd been in police custody for a little while. Interesting, huh? But that was how they were able to make the connection. He has a piece of identification showing yet an alias of Alec J. Hidell, and then, the guy who orders this rifle, he goes by A. Hidell. You can make the obvious inferences there that A stood for Alec. So he gets the rifle shipped to him. He keeps it at the home of Ruth Payne, who I've referenced numerous times in this thing. She befriended the Oswalds. More directly, she befriended Marina, Oswald's wife. And Marina was actually living with them while Oswald was living in another part of Dallas. They lived in Irving. He lived in Oak Cliff. And so the rifle reportedly was just kept in Ruth Payne's garage for a long time, apparently wrapped up in a blanket. It stays there until, reportedly, November 21st, 1963, the night before the assassination, when Oswald went out and stayed the night at the Payne home. Presumably grabbed his bag. He grabbed the rifle, put it into the bag that he supposedly made. I talk about this in my brown paper bag podcast. And, he's got it concealed, hitches a ride to work the next day with his buddy Bill Wesley Frazier, who supposedly sees this package with him. And even though it's way too small to contain the Mannlicher Carcano he supposedly bought, they say, Frazier only saw it one time. What the fuck does his opinion matter? Better yet, what the fuck does anybody's opinion matter? Because nobody described the package as being remotely long enough to have held this rifle, even when it was broken down. He goes to work, presumably sneaks the package in with him. Nobody's suspicious. It's just Oswald with the package. Even though shortly after he walks in, nobody he works with at any time sees this package. It's never seen again until reportedly it's found in the southeast corner of the 6th floor by the area that was deemed to be Oswald's, quote, sniper's nest. There was no official pictures taken of the package that was used to take it up, but officially it's there. Who cares about evidence? Like the Warren Commission said, we're here to close doors, not open them, which means we're not here to investigate, we're just here to mind fuck all of you, pretty much. So, obviously, as the story goes, Oswald goes up to the 6th floor, presumably with the rifle concealed, opens the package, takes the rifle out, takes only 3 shots, and then assassination takes place. He then finds a place to stash the rifle between some boxes, stashed it well enough that it took several minutes, long time, multiple officers up there searching before they finally found his weapon. And they take it, they dust it, they check it, blah, blah, blah. The process of things happens. They tie the weapon to Oswald. They say, we got the paper trail that he bought it. We know Alec J. Hiddell is Oswald, blah, 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 blah. And they determine it to be the murder weapon. And it sits today in the National Archives, I believe, as the official murder weapon of President Kennedy, which is total, utter nonsense. It was a Mannlicher Carcano rifle. This type of particular weapon was created in mass quantities quickly, which means it wasn't very well manufactured. They were made to they just needed to stock Italian soldiers in World War II. They needed to give them weapons to shoot with. So they mass manufactured these guns. They were really low grade. They were intended to be just used for a brief moment and then thrown away. They were throwaway weapons. They've been dubbed the humanitarian weapon because apparently they just sucked at killing. They just weren't good guns. They very seldomly hit the target properly, and they seldom killed people. I mean, obviously, you get up close to somebody with a rifle like this, you're going to kill them. But what I'm getting at is this is not a choice weapon for someone who's planning something as big as the assassination of a president to go out and buy. It's just not the logical decision. And the thing is Oswald, who made practically no money, apparently dropped I can't remember the exact price, but it was like $20 for this gun, working a $1.25 an hour job. I mean, if I'm making, $1.25 then is probably a little bit above, so that's probably $11 now. So that would be like me making, $1,100-$1,200 a month, and then I drop like $250 on a rifle out of nowhere. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And he could have found other weapons that were more effective for cheaper. It just doesn't make sense. And the thing is, beyond the basic history of this weapon, which is not flattering in terms of what it was created for, by the time Oswald gets it in 1963, I mean, we got a gun that's almost 25 years old. And who knows what battered use it went through during WW2. That's what I meant to say. I was starting to say W. So I think I was trying to say W number 2. GW. So who knows how battered this weapon was through its World War II experience. Who knows how much it was used afterward. And then it ultimately ends up in a department store selling for probably a lot more than it should have. But this particular weapon, in the aftermath, this was all discovered, and it's all stuff that it just, it goes ignored. This weapon had a scope mounted for a left-handed shooter. Oswald was right-handed, so immediately that makes no sense. They tried to, and the scope was misaligned. It wasn't even sighted properly, which meant, I think, I could be wrong, it could be the opposite, but I think it was sighted to shoot too high. So like if you were hunting and you were aiming your gun at a buck and you had the sight that you were looking, if you had the gun or the sight was telling you that it was focused right on the elk's head, you would end up shooting like 10, 15 feet over his head. Is essentially what would have happened. And Gerald Posner, one of the dumbest sons of bitches ever to live, he he was pretty much the guy that carried the torch after, things like the Men Who Killed Kennedy series came out that started bringing public's focus back into this case. And then, of course, the big one was Oliver Stone's film JFK. That suddenly got everybody up in arms again and asking questions about what the hell happened with this JFK assassination. It helped lead to the establishment of the Assassination Records Review Board, which, did some good work, but it didn't really change anything. But still, that was a huge thing. So, of course, at pretty much the same time that JFK comes out, Gerald Posner comes out with this book called Case Closed, which is, shut your mouth, Lee Harvey Oswald did it, we all know he did, case closed. And he literally uses fake testimony. There's literally parts of his book where you cannot find his sources anywhere. They'll be like, oh, so-and-so that he was in the Marines with said, oh, he actually was a really good shot. And then you can't find evidence of that anywhere. And he would just, seriously, the guy would just make things up. And one of the things that he made up, there's no evidence that I've ever found to validate this. He says that Oswald intentionally had his scope misaligned because it helped him practice, and he would apparently sit out on his porch. Apparently Marina saw him sitting out on his porch, aiming improperly to try to learn how to hit stuff without using the scope. This guy who, after, when he's in the Marines, he doesn't give two shits about becoming a good rifleman. And from the time he leaves the Marines up until the assassination, other than, the claims of him purchasing this rifle, there's no evidence at all that this guy cared about guns at all. In fact, he was a kind of a pacifist. He was just this guy that, sat in his, cot in the Marines readings, but the guy just read all the time. He was a pacifist reader. All right? Even when he had this incident in New Orleans where he supposedly goes into this guy's store, and this guy is a super anti-Castro guy. So Oswald goes in there and is like, oh yeah, I'm a big anti-Castro guy too. And then this guy finds out that Oswald later on is out there giving out pamphlets talking about how we need to leave them alone. So this guy goes and confronts him aggressively. He starts pushing him in the middle of the street and trying to fight him. And Oswald doesn't even fight back. Now, granted, a lot of people think this was a staged incident. But still, it's there's nothing that implies that Oswald was even a violent person. And yet, they have to present this notion that he was some kind of a gun nut. And yet, if he was so experienced with guns, why did he buy such a piece of shit? Even if he had no real, plans for it, no plans on killing JFK, he just was a guy that wanted to have some guns to practice whatever. Why would he buy such a piece of shit gun? And why would he mount the scope for a left-handed shooter? Oswald wasn't ambidextrous, and I'm sorry, I'm walking by the freeway, so you're probably going to start hearing some rustling. I've been taking the same route as I do these things. But yeah, the firing pin on the Mannlicher Carcano rifle was so rusted that when the Warren Commission got a hold of it and wanted to do test firing with it to see how good of a gun it was, the guys that were supposed to test fire it were like, no, we try firing this gun, the friggin' firing pin's just gonna break. So they had to reinforce the thing. They pretty much had to, fix up the gun to even make it usable, and yet Oswald apparently pulled off one of the greatest shooting feats in the history of the world with his mediocre rifle ability. So this gun in particular was very beat up, very worn out, just totally screwed up, and the scope was all off and it was put on wrong. It was like somebody else owned this gun and then just didn't use it and just left it somewhere, and it was just falling apart. But Lee Harvey Oswald buys the gun and shoots the president with it. No. And in that vein, we must backtrack. to the beginning of this story, which is, and this is the focus, is did Oswald own this gun? I say he didn't. There is no credible evidence that he did. Apparently, George de Mohrenschildt, who I referenced before, was this super well-to-do guy with lots of agency connections, and he's one of multiple people that come out and say, no, I don't think Oswald did this. No, this wasn't like Oswald. And then some time passes, the Warren Commission starts talking to him, and suddenly he comes out and says, Oswald's a this, and he's an, and Oswald's a, yeah, he could have done this, and I saw the gun that he owned one time, Marina, just like with the backyard photos, she was interviewed several times, harped on. She was interviewed by the Secret Service, the FBI, the police, all grilling her, saying, did he own the gun? Did he own the gun? You need to say yes, because he owned the gun, and we're going to prove it. We already know he did, so just say yes. I think there was at least 9 to 10 interviews that she had in the weeks after the assassination. Every single one, she said, my husband doesn't own a fucking gun. And then she goes into, quote, protective custody, pretty much done by the Warren Commission, so she's just gone for a little while. Who knows what was going on during that time? And then she pops up a little while later, and they dress her up all nice, make her look pretty, bring her out for an interview, and all of a sudden it's Oswald is this crazy son of a bitch, and I think he did it, and yeah, he owned a gun, and yeah, he did this. Yeah, he not only killed Kennedy, he killed Lincoln and McKinley too. It was obvious that they had manipulated her. They'd probably threatened her with any possible number of things. Again, this was a Russian native, now living in America. She has 2 children to take care of, 2 infants to take care of. Her husband is dead because he was shot by Jack Ruby 2 days after he supposedly killed JFK. So here's a woman with, relying on, almost handouts at this point, now that her husband's gone, and she's got 2 kids to raise, like any number of things. They could have threatened her children. They could have done anything. Could have made an open season on her. We can make you look really bad in the press, and since you're a Russian and it's the middle of the cold fucking war, we can make things very tough on you. They could have done any number of those things, scared the shit out of her, and I'm convinced that they did. So, suddenly she comes out. So, the few claims that suggest Oswald did own this rifle are claims made by people who beforehand denied it, and then clearly had it coaxed out of them. So just, he supposedly keeps it in the Payne's garage for months, and then, even when they talked to Ruth and Michael Payne, neither one of them had any idea that he had owned a rifle. Even in the men who killed Kennedy, they addressed the question directly. Ruth Payne says, I didn't even know to that point that he'd even owned a rifle. And here we have Michael Payne, her husband, who was also living there during most of that time. And he tells this very interesting story about how he actually had to pick up and move the blanket that Oswald's rifle was wrapped in, and he thought it was tent poles. Michael Payne was a war veteran. I believe he was in the Korean War, I want to say. And I know that he had extensive training in weapons. And then this guy, 1963, picks up a blanket with a rifle in it and confuses it for tent poles. But he had to admit that it was where the gun was, because that's what the official story says. He left it wrapped in a gun in their garage. Nobody ever saw it, but that has to have been what happened. That's literally, that's all they have to go on as far as evidence in terms of eyewitness accounts of anybody who saw or knew about this gun. Nothing except some coaxed, admissions that were probably brought on by threat. So, aside from the whole, excuse me, my nose is getting a little runny because it is cold. I'm amazed my iPhone's even still working. It usually dies when it gets cold enough, but anyway, we're still chugging along. So, besides the whole eyewitness aspect of things, you've got all sorts of problems with Oswald's ability to purchase this thing. First of all, you'd think, this guy lives in Texas. Why is he mail ordering an expensive piece of shit from, over 1,000 miles away in Chicago? It's Texas. There's a gun store on every block. I mean, I hate to be, stereotypical, but why would this guy go out of his way to do that? He would to create a paper trail. Because you could go into any gun store back then. They didn't background, especially in Texas, they weren't going to background check him. He didn't have to, give them, he's smart enough to use a fake name, but he's dumb enough to create a paper trail that reportedly says ship it to the box, this post office box that belongs to Lee Harvey Oswald, and they can verify that. Again, they try to paint the picture that Oswald was this dumbass loser who was just lost in his ways and just wanted a reputation, so he shot the president. They portray him as a stupid dumbass, which he absolutely was not. A stupid dumbass doesn't stay cool and collected through over 2 days of police grilling after he's grabbed off the street and charged with murdering the President of the United States. A crime that he's not going to get a life sentence. It's insane. It's insane. But they have to paint this picture that Oswald was a stupid dumbass who was smart enough to use a fake name, but dumb enough to leave a paper trail. He was smart enough to seemingly wipe his prints from the gun because they never found any fingerprints, like on the trigger. They found a smudged palm print a long time later, and I'll get to that story in a second. So he's smart enough to wipe off his rifle when he's done with it, apparently, because he didn't leave any fingerprints. If it was Oswald, he would have had to have cleaned them off. But then he leaves the 3 shells that ejected from his rifle that are right there at his feet. Would take him no time to pick them up. He leaves those there to be found. It's just like James Earl Ray. They say James Earl Ray killed Martin Luther King, which he absolutely did not. And, the guy shoots him, flees the area, runs down to his car and takes off, but then manages to drop a box full of incriminating evidence right there in front of this building. Stuff that he wouldn't have even owned, but some of the stuff in there was his property. And he just drops it there. Oh, thank you for the convenient piece of evidence we can use against you. But yeah, see, that's another critical thing too, is they literally, because they checked this weapon on the scene. There's amateur video and news video taken of the fingerprint examiner guy, the main guy for the Dallas police, Lieutenant Day. I can't remember his first name, but they have video of him dusting the rifle for prints, and they didn't find anything. That's reported in documentation. They never found Oswald's prints on the rifle in that initial examination. And then, like everything else, a few days later, suddenly, there's Oswald's part of his palm print shows up on the rifle after it wasn't found. And they weren't even trying in this regard. The main mortician at the funeral home where Oswald's body was being kept after he died, one night, 2 agents show up, probably FBI agents. I know there's a particular FBI agent that has specifically admitted to being one of these guys. They show up with the gun, and they ask the mortician guy if they can have some time alone with the body. So, of course, they're agents, so he's like, oh, okay. And then they come out, they go in, they're in with the body for a while alone, and then they come out and leave. And the mortician guy goes into the room afterward, and there's ink all over Oswald's hands because they printed him, and they had the gun with them. They literally walked up to this mortician guy, not even trying to be secretive, and they just walked right into the room, took his prints, and then suddenly, boom, Oswald finally has a print show up on the rifle. Like, how does that happen? How does an event like that happen? And then people still argue that there was nothing strange about this whole case. Like, they didn't even try to be sneaky. They could have at least broken into the mortuary in the middle of the night and done it. Like, it's insane. But there you go. How does this guy buy this rifle, supposedly practice with it a whole bunch, and then he uses it, and no prints show up? Not one. And then suddenly one appears. Absolutely insane. Total fraudulent nonsense. So, you have this issue of why would Oswald be that dumb? And then, and this is very interesting, this is something I actually learned in recent years as opposed to several years ago, was when you do a money order, I don't know if this is how we do it now, but this was how they did it back then. The money order has to go through like multiple, like, in banking institutions, and I don't know it as well as the people that, discovered this oddity about it, but essentially there should have been multiple banking institutions that this money order should have gone through before ultimately making it to Chicago. It's almost similar to, like, when you send a package somewhere. Like, if you're sending a package from, like, New York to Denver, it's not just going to go straight from New York to Denver, unless you're lucky enough to get, like, a plane flight or something. It's going to go to, Cleveland, and then St. Louis, and then, Omaha, then Denver, something like that. Like, there's just places it has to go through on its way there. And each of these banking institutions leaves a stamp, like an identifying stamp, so that there's proof that it went through there. Well, Oswald's money order for this rifle didn't have all the necessary stamps on it, which makes it come off essentially as just a fraudulent document. And of course, Oswald denied any of this. He denied buying the rifle, he denied owning it, he denied, that's where his famous quote came up, where he said, how's a guy that makes $1.25 an hour gonna buy a $20 rifle? How's that gonna happen? It's not. That's the answer to that question. So, and then I just totally lost my train of thought. So there's all kinds of problems. And what's also interesting is the time in which he does this. He apparently goes on his meal break at work and goes to, the post office to send this slip out, or this money order to buy the weapon. But the post office that he goes to do it is, like, not even in the same district as where he worked. Like, he had to go out of his way to do this. The problem with that is not just how do you get all the way there and back on a meal break, but Oswald didn't have a car. He didn't have any way to make it to an out-of-the-way post office in enough time. So, how did that happen? How was this guy able to apparently stop time to make this delivery to the post office? None of it makes sense. None of it works. It all points to somebody else doing this. Pre-planning. Whenever this happens, and they were probably doing this for other people. There was a Chicago plot that apparently was foiled. There was a Miami plot that was foiled. It's not known for certain whether the Miami plot was actually planned to happen in Miami, but there was discussion of assassinating Kennedy in Miami. So, it seems like there were multiple, and there was another fall guy in Chicago that obviously didn't have to take the fall because the Chicago plot never happened. So it seems clear that they had more than one person. This wasn't just Oswald from day one, but they had plots set up in multiple cities and multiple potential fall guys. Because if they do pull it off in Chicago, how do you blame Lee Harvey Oswald, who's in Dallas all this time? You can't. So I believe there were probably multiple people set up as possible fall guys for various different cities, because it seems like, there were definitely plans that preceded Dallas. Dallas was just the one that ended up working. So Oswald's our man in Dallas. He takes the fall. That's how I take that. So that means they would start planning this way in advance. So it makes all the sense in the world, They have Oswald, over the whole summer of '63, doing all this really strange stuff in New Orleans, looking like a commie. He's in the Soviet Union for several years in something that comes off as definitely something that was pre-planned. And so it would make all the sense in the world that somebody else who could maybe, I'm sure they had samples of Oswald's writing and could find someone to match his writing really well. They find out his post office box. They make this fake document when the fact of the matter is they probably got the gun from a whole other place. They probably already had the gun, but they needed a paper trail. So it's just like, Klein Sporting Goods, Chicago. What places around the country sell guns of this type? And here, in 1963, you have Klein Sporting Goods selling Carcano rifles. Why they would pick a Carcano as his weapon of choice, I have no fucking clue. Really dumbass decision on their part. But again, I think these people that pulled this off were used to just, doing enough work to get by and getting away with it. People didn't contest things like this the way they did, There's before Kennedy was killed and after Kennedy was killed, and different ways that people address it. So, while it seems like this whole thing was a farce, and they created a fake paper trail, fake name, using Oswald's mailbox, it's all staged so that they can come back out of the assassination and be like, oh, look at that, paper trail, showing that Oswald owned the gun. Isn't that interesting? But they couldn't even get it done right. Just too many things to cover, and eventually things are going to get tripped up on. Whoever was in charge of making sure there was enough stamps on the fake money order obviously fucked their job up. And there's a lot of ways in which they screwed up because there was just too much ground to cover. Things were going to get missed. Things were going to get overlooked. Things were, timing was going to become an issue, and they were going to be like, okay, well, just forget about that thing. It doesn't matter. And then years later, researchers dig up those little things that they said, screw it, it doesn't matter, we don't have time, that now show conspiracy. And one of these interesting little things that bolsters the fact that this was not a valid purchase by Oswald from Klein Sporting Goods, and that it was likely they already just had a weapon, is the weapon, the advertisement that has officially been shown as this was the ad that, Oswald saw an American rifleman and purchased the weapon from, not only is from a different edition of the magazine than that he supposedly purchased from, it's from a different month, but the ad used advertises a different length weapon. The ad literally doesn't advertise the weapon that was officially found in the Texas School Book Depository. Talk about slipping up, overlooking a small detail, but a small detail that shows, oh, hey, Oswald didn't buy the rifle. You know how we know that? Because the ad that he bought the fucking rifle from is for a different weapon. So even if you could argue that paper trail is valid, which you cannot, you have to argue that he bought a different weapon. a weapon he apparently chose to leave at home so he could use a different rifle of a similar make, just a different length, that was probably most definitely in shittier condition, and he used that one. That's the best thing you can argue. But then you have no paper trail tying Oswald to the official assassination weapon. So you're back at square one with that. You can't claim that it's his now because you don't have... even the fake paper trail doesn't work anymore. All these things, hundreds of little things like this that alone show the official case was fraudulent nonsense. And people still argue that the official case is accurate. And it boggles my mind to no end. The whole paper trail didn't work. Like, it literally could not have gone the way that they said it was. And here's another problem. Let's play devil's advocate and put everything about him purchasing the weapon and that process. Let's put all that aside. We could act like that didn't happen. Or like everything in that vein was accurate. They pulled up Lee Harvey Oswald's application for the post office box that he reportedly received the rifle through. And there's a particular section in that, I think it's section 3, where you stipulate whether anybody else, family, friends, what have you, can pick up mail in that box. And if you leave that section blank, that tells the post office people that nobody else can pick up mail there. So maybe you're thinking like, well, big deal. Oswald bought the rifle, so it will go to his mailbox. Well, he took the post office box out in his real name, Lee Harvey Oswald. So if he purchased the weapon as Alec Hidell, and thus had it, Kleins is going to see this form and say, oh, this A. Hidell guy brought this rifle, then they are going to ship it to Oswald's mailbox, but use the name A. Hidell, which means this item is going to show up with a different name for a post office box wherein the person who owns it, Oswald, has said no mail for anybody who is not me, Lee Harvey Oswald. So, had this package even been legitimately bought and sent to the post office where Oswald had a box at, they wouldn't have put it in his box. They most likely would have returned it to sender. That would have been the step. They would have been like, oh, we don't have an A. Hidell here. And even if, Lee Harvey, somehow the post office employees knew that Lee Harvey Oswald had the alias A. Hidell, which is not even legitimate 100% proof of that, then they still couldn't do it because the rule would say only mail for Lee Harvey Oswald goes in to this post office box. That's it. So he couldn't have even gotten the gun from the post office. And no postal employees there recalled receiving a big package for an Alec Hidell, receiving a big package for Lee Harvey Oswald for a specific box, and no one recalls him ever coming in to pick it up or coming in to be like, hey, I purchased something to come into my mailbox, and it's been such and such amount of time. Has anything come for me to go, So he couldn't have even gotten this rifle, couldn't have even gotten it to his mailbox. And even then, he didn't even bother to come in to check. Like, maybe he buys it under Alec J. Hidell and he forgets or doesn't realize that he can't get mail under a different name at his mailbox. He would go in and pester them about it, or contact Kleins and be like, hey, I didn't get my rifle at the post office. Did you guys send it? And no, there's no evidence that Oswald contacted anybody regarding anything about this rifle. The official story is he bought it, it got shipped, he got it at his post office box, and here he's got his gun. And none of that is possible with all this stuff that I've just told you. That is verified. You don't have to take my word for it. You can do your own research. just be wary of shitty sources, or sources where you get a piece of information and it's not verified by any other type of source. That's what they tell you. The more people that verify a story, like a lot of major news stories where they're saying, hey, I got this, pretty big story that such and such of this, and then numma is happening. You're the main guy that runs the paper is going to tell you, like, oh, well, you need to get a couple more sources on that. That's a big thing in the 1976 film All the President's Men, that delves into Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, these two writers for the Washington Post, who just dug to expose what was going on with the Richard Nixon White House and Watergate and all that. And there's an ongoing thing where their main publisher, Ben Bradley, who's played by Jason Robards, and interestingly enough played by Tom Hanks in the new Post movie. They're both portraying the same guy. There's this ongoing thing like, well, you need more sources. You need another source. Or this source didn't work, so you have to get another one. And Dustin Hoffman at one point is like, how many fucking sources does he think we have? So that's a big thing in terms of researching. So yeah, that's for all you intrigued researchers out there. Make sure your info is good. So we have the verified fact that the process by which Oswald supposedly bought his weapon not only has not been verified by any valid documentation, or even the claims that they claim that they did handwriting analysis on the the order he did, and it's a mixed bag. The people that the Warren Commission hires say it's Oswald's handwriting. Other people say it's not. You're back at square one. Like when you go into court, someone and you're trying to claim whether or not a guy on trial is mentally ill or not. Prosecution will tell the defense, you have your doctors, I have mine. The documentation, the money order, such and such, is all jacked up. He couldn't have gotten the weapon anyway. It would have been stored at the post office and then returned to sender. They'd be like, this guy's not here. So that whole element, the whole genesis of how does Oswald obtain this weapon, is nullified. And then supposedly it's just sitting in the Payne's garage, and after the assassination happens, they supposedly, these are the words of Gus Rose, who was a Dallas officer and a real piece of shit. He, interestingly enough, was also interviewed in one of the greatest documentary films ever made, which is The Thin Blue Line. I've watched it several times. And it chronicles the case, another Texas-based case near Dallas. That's why this Gus Rose guy was involved in both cases. And it was actually done the same year as the men who killed Kennedy, so you see him get interviewed in both of them, and he looks exactly the same because they were done the same year. But in short, The Thin Blue Line chronicles the story of this Dallas officer and his partner who pull over this car. The officer walks up to the car, and the guy driving just pulls a gun out and shoots him several times and takes off. And they ultimately bust this guy that had just moved there from, I think, Ohio. This guy named Randall Adams. They bust him for the shooting, even though they have nothing to go on. And it's amazing to watch these fucking Dallas police officers talking out their ass to try to defend this case. When it was blatantly clear this other guy, who happened to be hanging out with Adams and was just a fucking lunatic, it was blatantly obvious that he did the shooting, but he was a local. So, he's a good old Texas boy. He's not going to do anything wrong. And the film was showing the clear case that Adams was innocent. And Adams was sitting on death row at the time. So, and ultimately, shortly after, he got released from prison. I mean, obviously, significantly from that the feedback from that film. Well, in the interview, Randall Adams, he tells this story about Gus Rose coming in and trying to literally manipulate him into signing a bullshit confession saying that he did it, and talking about how Gus Rose literally pulled his gun out and pointed at him and said, sign it, like, or I'm going to shoot you. And I absolutely believe that. Even though this Gus Rose guy, he's one of these soft-spoken Texas policemen. So when they interview him, he's like, well, he came in, he sat down, and guy acts like he's just this mild-mannered guy trying to uphold the law. So even as late as the late 70s, which is when this shooting occurred, we got further evidence that Gus Rose was just this corrupted cock sucker of a cop. And I'm sorry to use such foul language, but this is the same guy who, in 1963, he's one of the main officers sent to Ruth Payne's home. And he tells this cockamamie story that totally goes against what Marina spent the next several weeks saying. He paints it like she knew right away that Oswald was the killer. He says that when he came to the door, she was like, come on in, I've been expecting you. This is right after the assassination. Oswald's been busted, but it's just that whole oh, I knew he would do it, and I knew you'd be coming to talk to me. And so, and then there's this whole story, and of course, this is all told through Gus Rose and Ruth Payne. And Gus Rose is a crooked cop, and Ruth Payne is, I don't know what, she's a real interesting piece of work, and there's lots of theories that expound on how and why she ended up even getting into Marina's life. So it's through these two that we hear this story that they go into, Marina leads them into the Payne garage and points at this blanket and is like, that's where my husband keeps his rifle. This woman who spends the next several weeks being grilled by the FBI and the Secret Service and says, my husband didn't own a gun. He didn't own a gun. I'm telling you, he didn't own a gun. But he just leads the police on the day of the assassination. Gus Rose, this crooked cock, just leads him into the garage and says, it's right there. And then one of the officers picks the blanket up and it goes limp, like there's no gun in here now. So then that's, their clear distinction. Oh, there was a gun in here and now it's gone. This must be the gun that was found at the Texas School Book Depository. This gun that didn't even frickin' have Oswald's prints on it, and it's mounted for a person whose dominant hand is the left, Oswald's dominant hand is the right, the scope is fucked to hell, and yet somehow Oswald fires two perfect shots. One shot he hits the president right where he needs to, and the other shot he manages to hit two people. Single bullet theory. More commonly known by its critics as the magic bullet theory, and trust me, I'm going to probably have a very long EXPLORIAN episode on that. That may be the next one I do, I don't know. I'm going to need to have my batteries pretty seriously charged to do that one. That one may break 2 hours. But this is the official story. I just went through it bit by bit, eyewitness accounts. The path of purchase. Even, you have a fudged up scenario where you have the wrong weapon being purchased. You have an unsubstantiated money order. You have a weapon that couldn't have got to where it needed to get for Oswald to have it. It shows you the signs that, this weapon that was found on the 6th floor of Texas School Book Depository was certainly not bought by Oswald from American Riflemen from Klein Sporting Goods back in earlier 1963. Whether he was the assassin or not, that aspect is irrelevant to this point. Fact of the matter is, the weapon, even if he bought the weapon, again, it would have been a different Carcano rifle. So they can say that he owned another Carcano rifle, but that doesn't help them in this case. So even if you can argue, it's his handwriting, it's his money order, Went to his box. You can prove he's Alec Cadell. It all boils down to it was purchasing a different rifle. So none of that information even matters. So you have no paper trail, no verification whatsoever that he purchased specifically the Maliker Carcano found in the Texas Schoolbook Depository. You have no evidence. Even if he owned a rifle, all this stuff they hear would have to boil down to it was this other one that he maybe kind of sort of bought. And we can even prove that didn't happen. The few eyewitness accounts there were clearly were coaxed. These verifications of his ownership of a rifle, not even specifically the one that was found, all came from people who beforehand said, no, he didn't own it. I didn't see him own any gun. He didn't own any gun. No, he was a pacifist. He hated doing rifle range stuff. He always kept his guns and stuff. His gun was never clean. It was always disorganized. He always got chewed out when he was in the Marines for having, an unsatisfactory weapon. That wasn't cleaned or oiled properly or stored properly, whatever the case. So there's nothing in this whole case. All you have is Lee Harvey Oswald worked in the Texas Schoolbook Depository. There's belief and some verification that they were shooting from that building, and you found this random rifle on the 6th floor. So if you're going to, that's all you have to go on in this case to say it was Oswald and it was his gun. So essentially you have to make a purely speculative case based purely on what barely qualifies as circumstantial evidence to say that weapon, whether it was a murder weapon or not, is even Oswald's. You had to prove the weapon they randomly found is Oswald's before you can even prove that it was involved in the shooting, which there's plenty of evidence to show that it wasn't. The doctor said it was high velocity rounds that were fired into Kennedy and Conley, and the Maliker Carcano was medium velocity at best. So, like everything I've talked about, the brown paper package, where was Oswald before, during, and after the assassination? The backyard photos. It's another case where when all is said and done, we have another piece of evidence that proves nothing against Lee Harvey Oswald, and yet we have piece after piece after piece of proof showing that there was pre-planning by others. There was corruption of the evidence. There was lying. All this stuff in the aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination. And the claims of ownership of the rifle on Oswald's case is just another example of that. So let that stew around in your head for a little while and see what that all means. Because I'm cutting you off right here. That's all I got to say for the night. And again, I probably missed a few things because there's so much to talk about in terms of Oswald's ownership of the rifle. There's a great, I think it's a 2-piece article called The Great Carcano Swindle that discusses it literally tells you the whole history of the specific rifle that was found and all the stuff in terms of whether it belonged to Oswald or not. So, good piece of reading. I don't remember who it's by, but if you look up The Great Carcano Swindle, like in quotes, as a Google search, you'll probably find it pretty quickly. So, that's your homework for the night. Until next time, thanks for listening to it. If you made it to the end of this, you're a real trooper, because these have turned out to be pretty long, as I figured they would be. So, all that said, till next time, guys, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian with another episode of EXPLORIAN.